Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. Now this is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Peter Ndoro. Thanks very much for joining us. This is what's coming up on the programme today. Media trust. Now that's a big issue, isn't it? Yeah, yet again it's in the spotlight. And this week it comes after a story left some Africans divided on whether it was true or not. Yeah, and I'm sure you know the story I'm talking about. It is a woman who gave birth to 10 children. Veteran journalist Gwen Lister's memoir, in which she recounts her life and her journey in journalism and her experiences before and after independence in Namibia, is out, and we get to chat to her about this book. And it's been a truly remarkable life lived. One of the best investigative journalists on the continent, and so much to tell. I wonder how she was able to put it all into her book. We'll find out a little bit later on. We also have our regular features, Back in History, where we take you back to the year 2005 when South Africa lost a young queen. Can you guess her name? Stay tuned for that and more coming up on the programme. But first, let's start by taking a reminder that you can also engage with us on social media. And that's the Twitter handle there, hashtag SABC Media Monitor. If you'd like to comment on something that you see on the programme and hear on the programme, we'd love to hear from you. So please use that hashtag and we'll get to your messages. Right, before we get into those stories on the programme, let's find out what's on the front pages of your newspapers today. And this is the story. We start with the Sunday Times. And this paper is reporting on how PRASA is pushing ahead with a 3.5 billion rand deal to buy locomotives that were found to be too tall for South Africa's rail network, even though a court ruled that the deal was corrupt. And the Zindoga probe heard how it led to big donations to the Jacob Zuma Foundation. The City Press, that's the cover of the City Press. Let's take a look at, and again here, President's foes to resist CR capture. And this is all about the President Cyril Ramaphosa camp apparently aggressively consolidating its grip on the ANC and the Zuma and Magashule backers' plan as backing a fierce fight back in the coming week. This is a story that we'll certainly be following. The Sunday Independent, let's take a look at that. That's leading with a special investigating unit probe into the procurement of personal protective equipment, which has uncovered that most companies awarded contracts were not accredited or certified to handle or distribute said equipment. The Sunday Tribune is reporting on how today marks 12 days of prison confinement of corruption accused and international businessman Iqbal Sharma, which is a far cry from the luxury his mansion multi-million rand home affords him. Sharma was denied bail at the Bloemfontein Magistrates Court earlier this week as he was considered a flight risk. And the Weekend Argus, let's take a look at that cover. And the Weekend Argus, right, PPE contracts null and void, I think is a similar story. All right, Sunday World. Dr. Zwelumkhize on the cover again this week. Big U-turn, Department of Health backtracks on plans to suspend officials implicated in the Digital Vibes saga with fears that they were going to implicate the minister. Right, let's get into our first story of the program today. Media trust was again thrust into the spotlight this week in South Africa. This as after the public was left divided on the validity of a story about the birth of 10 babies in Tembisa, and that's on Johannesburg East Rand, Gauteng's East Rand. News 24, Times Live, the South African.com, and a number of lesser-known publications all demanded proof. Well, their headlines ranged from, "Is it true? Can't find verification," to interviews with experts on why having 10 babies would be an impossible feat. Meanwhile, the Gauteng government poured oil into the fire on Wednesday when it said that there was no record of the birth of 10 babies in any of its health facilities, saying that the story could be fake news. However, Ekurhuleni Mayor Mzwandile Masina later tweeted that they had found the family and the babies are all well. He promised to later share the information with the national government. But before we engage with our guests on this story and media trust in general, let's take a look at some thoughts that have been coming through during the week.
I don't really trust the stories that I see or read in the media. I think it's best if you see them on your own, like if you experience them on your own, because sometimes media can do things in their own way. Media is not right. Like we all know that media is very not right. It has scammed.
I do trust in the stories I see on social media, because it's things that are happening around everywhere. So yeah.
For me, I don't really do, because there is fake news out there and it does give you a false image of things that's happening around you.
I don't trust stories that I read from the media, not unless I do a proper research on what I found on media or something like that.
Personally, I don't trust anything I see on, whether it's media, social media, any form of media, because I've seen like behind the scenes and I know that some people, it's not really what they say it is, or sometimes it's like overemphasized.
There's a lot of fake news that goes around on social media. It makes it very hard to actually trust what's true and what's not. So I think what's easiest to trust is the actual news and not social media.
All right, so an interesting take from the public in terms of whether they trust the media to tell us the truth about certain stories. And this one certainly highlighted the questions around whether we can trust the media or not, because it just seemed as if the media were not all on the same page, as it were. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by SABC foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena. We're also joined by the co-founder and host of Inside Fact, Modibe Modiba, and also the director of Media Monitoring Africa, William Bird. To all of my guests, a very good morning to you. Welcome. I think let's start with ladies first. And Sophie, you must be concerned that the public would come out with comments like this in a story particularly that should have been global news.
Well, Peter, indeed, as a foreign editor, I was also intending, or I am still trying to get people who can speak to us on this story, because the story was able to make it to international big newspapers abroad, online, and broadcasters, because there was a belief that this is history and it warrants to be in Guinness Book of Records. And therefore, it was an international story. I think when you listen to what people are saying, and let us take note, these are young people majority. These are young people who rely on social media. And that is why they are saying, I don't trust social media because there's fake news out there. They don't talk about the traditional media. And we must take pride in a sense that when you listen to those sound bites, it is about social media more than traditional media. And therefore, the nation is not aware that you can still trust the traditional media, but the social media might be a problem, because with a click of a button, a person can post information and only to find out that information is not true. But coming to this story of Peter Ndoro, I have worked with Peter Ndoro for quite a long time at the SABC. I don't doubt his human interest, love for those kind of stories. And he has done previously good human interest stories at the SABC. You can go to the archives. I think why there was this noise, there was a story when Pete was working for a particular publication that was that led to certain questions asked the rogue unit. The question for me is, was there a rogue unit or there was no rogue unit? As far as I know, as a former political reporter during those years, there was a unit within SARS that was charged with the responsibility to investigate syndicates, particularly transnational crime, people who were evading taxes and all of that. And you needed an intelligence expertise to be able to crack those cases. It is for that reason I think the Minister of Finance then and SARS head then took a decision that they must establish a specialized group of people within SARS to deal with such cases. But then, you know, media like to, we give names to certain developments, and then it later became familiar with the name Rogue Unit. But later at the state capture, it appeared that the minister, who was then the SARS head, did agree that there was a specialized group of people who were dealing with that kind of crime, and they had expertise of intelligence. And that is why people are calling that group a rogue unit. And then poor Pete had to answer why he was talking about rogue unit. There was no rogue unit. The reality is there was a specialized group within SARS that had to deal with that.
The naming of it is what got him into trouble more than anything else.
Yes.
Then. All right, okay. Modibe Modiba, thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. Do you think that this story became about who wrote it rather than actually allowing people to marvel and be amazed at the fact that a woman had given birth to 10 kids, and that would have been the first in the world?
Look, I think that the story now became about Pete and the attacks, because the story was released by Peter Ndoro and by independent media. In this country, there's an attack on independent media, and there's always been an attack on Pete, on how he reports, because he doesn't toe the line, simply because of that. So you saw even mainstream media and traditional media, journalists attacking Pete, instead of going to Pete and asking him, how can we get information about this story? You know, they made him look at it as if he's delusional, he's crazy, it's fake news, and now people want to see the pictures of the 10 babies, you know? And I think this is where Peter Ndoro got it correct, because as he's a black journalist. And you know that in the African tradition and in African culture, when babies are born, we don't post them on social media. We don't post them take pictures and post and send to friends, and it's a thing that is done internally and in secret until the babies are now well, so that we can now post and invite people to come see them. So to now say that Pete must now post pictures of those 10 babies would be going against African tradition and customs. Because if Pete now was going to release those pictures of those babies, we were going to attack Pete to say, why are you doing this? Because in African tradition, we don't do that. So I think now this is where the issue of African tradition and customs come into our media space as well. How do you now absorb those two things into traditional media? But we know, with going back to the issue of the SARS and the rogue unit, we saw what they did to Pete. They made him seem as if he's crazy, as if he's delusional. But there was that rogue unit within SARS, and people have SARS have confirmed that there was a rogue unit at SARS. So what people are saying was not far-fetched, was not fake news. It was something that was there and that happened. But also, just to touch on the issue of social media, and that young people lie on social media, there will be a fair and very fair assessment to make, because it was traditional media that first said that Jacob Zuma has a house in Dubai. People have never seen that house. It was people on social media were asking where is the address of that house. You know, News 24 ran with a story that Benny McCarthy is going to be the coach of Bafana Bafana. They said it's confirmed, and they released an article about that in City Press. It was social media people who corrected News 24 and who corrected traditional media to say that this story is fake news. There's no such a thing because traditional media itself works on rumors. They don't work on facts anymore. That's why young people on social media are resorting to platforms like the Inside Factor, which are growing. Every day we are gaining more than 2.5 followers on Twitter. Because people don't want organic news. They want fresh, exciting things, you know? And that is where platforms like traditional media are failing. Because
Okay, all right. So you've said quite a lot, which we'll unpack just now. But William, I want to ask you, what does it say about the media? And as a consumer of news, when I see one media house questioning what a reporter in another media house has written?
Hi, well, so look, I think it's important that we do distinguish between media, that they're not this single entity and single thing. You know, there are a number of different media houses and there are a number of different platforms on which they are all, that you can find all of your media. You know, Sophie made the critical point that there's a distinction between social media and news, and what is considered news, and what and who signs up to news, and what kind of ethics and values people agree to adhere to. So the SABC, as the public broadcaster, adheres to the principles contained in the Broadcasters Code of Conduct, as well as the ethical editorial principles that it has to adhere to. And that means that when they do a story, they can't just make it up. They have to rely on evidence that they can gather, on sources that can give them accurate quality news. Now, when you get a news entity that diverts from that significantly, and one of the, you know, we've been speaking about the Rogue Unit. This was some years ago now, and we're still talking about that and the damage that it did to the Sunday Times' credibility, right? People still question it. They question that. You've just heard Modibe questioning the credibility of News 24 for some of the stories that they ran. So when a news organization makes an error, they publish something that they then either have to retract or something, the way that they do that counts. But when you get an organization that does that on a fairly consistent or regular basis, when you then get a big story like the one that broke this week, you know, you can forgive people for saying, well, this is on OOL. Do we necessarily trust that? And is there evidence to that? And what evidence is provided in the story that enables us to make a decision to say, yes, this is accurate or not, right? So if you read any of your stories that you look at on your Sunday papers that you've just gone through, you know, if you read and you go through them, they'll say, according to these sources in these places, this is who determined that the PPE contracts were crooked, etc., or they weren't. You know, they're going to be different forms of evidence, and on the basis of that, you make a decision whether or not you believe that. So where we are at now in South Africa is that we've got increasing levels of mis and disinformation. We've got levels of trust in our media that are still actually comparatively high, according to the research that was released, I think it was towards the end of last year or beginning of this year, around our media. And you've got the public broadcaster. So it really is critical that you've got media that people can and do trust, especially when it comes to news, because that's how you make decisions about how to live your life in many instances.
Okay, all right. Let me come back to you, Sophie. And again, the question for me is, how do we explain to the readers, consumers, when you have a government minister saying one thing, a premier or another politician saying something else? Isn't it the job of the media to sort through all of this and do basic work? Phone the hospital.
The media must expose that contradiction within government. Because if you are a government technocrat, you have to do your work without fear or favor or have a political connotation. As a technocrat, the technocrat is supposed to call and make proper investigations, even speak to the political heads who are responsible for that kind of information, or who would have that kind of information. In this case, I expect a government technocrat to call Gauteng government to check, to call the local government level to check, and also to call the Minister, for example, of Social Development and the Minister of Health. These are the two ministries that would have information. And then sit down and think. Don't quickly dismiss information when you didn't do a proper investigation. Don't, as a technocrat, become a politician. Be a technocrat. Because you know these journalists, there are these perceptions around these journalists. You are quick to dismiss what the journalist has written, or a newspaper or a broadcaster has shared with the nation. You will be found wanting. I think that's where we have to say, after all the challenges the country has gone through, it is time for South Africans to do what is right wherever we are in different sectors. A technocrat cannot be a politician. A politician cannot be a technocrat. Today we're dealing with allegations of corruption and all of that because technocrats decided to be politicians, taking directives from politicians, knowing that they are the ones who are supposed to sign, and a political head doesn't sign. So I think we need to ensure that the civil service in South Africa go back to the drawing board to ensure that they understand their duties. They must remain technocrats, not politicians influenced by the prevailing political environment.
Okay. Modibe, should people trust the media given what's played out? And we're just using this story as an example more than anything else. That shouldn't be about us focusing on just one story, but I think it does tell a story about the state of our media and the questions that it raises for the average citizen, because we should have done the work and made sure that there is no doubt, and that we expose politicians that are lying, and as Sophie said, and confirm with the ones that are confirming. Do you think that people are justified in a level of mistrust in the media now?
Yes, I think South African media has for a very long time taken an anti-black and anti-African posture with regards to how it reports on corruption, for example. Anything which is seen as black is already seen as incompetent and corrupt. But anything which is white is seen as being expert advice, and we've seen South African media live for a very long time. So people are justified to say we no longer resort to traditional mainstream media. We want an alternative, But also I think it also goes back to the issue of racial. Or the racial question in our country. If the story was released by Daily Maverick, for example, would people have questioned that story that was taken out by independent media and Peter Ndoro? If it was taken out by a white journalist, would people have questioned that story by Peter Ndoro? So those are also other questions we must ask ourselves as South Africans, to say that when things are done by one media house, they get attacked. But when things are done by another media house, they're seen as being factual or correct because they are white-owned. For example, when we released when the Inside Factor released the ANC NEC leaks, people attacked us. The ANC wrote a statement attacking us for releasing leaked information that their members were leaking. When Daily Maverick had Gupta leaks, they were called investigative journalists, they were given awards. Nobody attacked them. The ANC never attacked them. During President Zuma's time, NEC things used to be leaked every weekend. Nobody attacked any media house. But now when it's done by a black-owned media publication, it gets questioned and then they get attacked. So I think it just goes back to the issue of, if the story was written by a white journalist, I'm telling you now, I'll put my head on the block now, nobody was going to question that story. But because it was taken out by Peter Ndoro, a black person who works for a black-owned media company, it had to be questioned. But the sad thing is, it was also questioned by black journalists themselves, who understand African traditions and customs, you know. And look at how media is reporting about ESCOM. Andre de Reich is seen as being incompetent. Media is not saying that he's the worst performing CEO in 98 years of ESCOM. But if it was a black CEO at ESCOM, media would be writing, would see opinion pieces in newspapers every week. Content producers on radio will be running with that thing every week on the radio, on talk show radios. So now because it's a white CEO at ESCOM, he's seen as being competent. But the facts speak for themselves. That is the most incompetent CEO ESCOM has ever had.
All right.
So I think it just goes back to those dynamics.
Okay, and then perhaps a final word from you then, William. Your comments on what Modibe has said, because if this is true, then for sure the consumers, readers, can't trust the media because it's all based on race. William?
The biggest media in South Africa and the mainstream media is the public broadcaster, you know, and so as I said before, we must be very cautious of, you know, grouping all mainstream media together. The public broadcaster has spent the last couple of years rebuilding its credibility in the quality of news that it has done and the quality of news that it produces. And by and large, it gets things mostly right. Of course, they make errors, as all news organizations do. But then when they do, they correct them and they're able to then move on and continue producing news that people can believe in and that people can trust. And that's an incredibly important thing that you have in a democracy. So when you then say, you know, this is the case because all of the media would never do this, and you know, it especially when you don't actually have evidence to support and back up that claim, it then becomes something that itself undermines trust and credibility in the media. So it is really important that when we talk about these things, we say in this instance there's enough evidence that shows that these and these and these things didn't happen. That's why you have all of these processes. You have the Broadcast Complaints Commission, so that if you have a complaint about a news story, you can go there, it can be unpacked, all of those things can be interrogated, because it is important that you don't just say, you know, our media as a whole you can't be trusted, and that isn't borne out by the evidence that, as I said, was produced. As I think it was the end of last year or the early part of this year, that shows that people do in fact trust our news media. We've seen a significant level of increase and traffic to all of our news organizations because of the pandemic, and it really is critical that people do trust that. Why? So that they can understand, they can hear about the PPE scandals, they can hear about digital vibes, they can hear about you know, the third wave that's coming, they can hear about the, you know, the vaccination rollout and where things are going. Without news media, you wouldn't know those things, and that's why it's really important that they are able to do that, and that they focus on getting those things right all of the time, and that we then focus on building up trust and credibility that says we adhere to these and these standards, these are our editorial policies. If you think that we violate them, let us know, send a complaint to us and or to the respective organization. It's when you don't adhere to those things that then you also then start to run into a problem where you undermine your own level of credibility.
Comrade Editor. Now, this is the story of Gwen Lister, activist, journalist who achieved global renown for opposing South Africa's occupation of Namibia. Amongst what Lister shares in the memoir is her decades-long experience in the newspaper business and the perils of outspoken journalism and the effects that it's had on herself and her family. Well, let's join her now in conversation. Veteran Namibian journalist, co-founder of the Windhoek Observer and the Namibian Gwen Lister. Gwen, great to talk to you. What an honor, I must say. And I guess the first question is, and I saw you at a TED Talk where you said you find it really difficult to talk about yourself. It must have been enormously hard to write a whole book.
Peter, you're absolutely right. You've hit the nail on the head. And by the way, thanks so much for having me on today. Good to talk to you too. Yeah, the book is a difficult one, mainly because it really follows the three strands of my own personal life growing up under apartheid, also the story of journalism and many, many decades in journalism, and finally, of course, the birth of Namibia. And I guess of those three strands, the most difficult one is, of course, talking about the personal and the private. It's always difficult, especially growing up under apartheid and being an activist. One always protected one's privacy because you knew everybody was watching you, listening to the phones, checking who was coming to your house. So I guess that's been the most difficult part, is actually opening up about myself.
There's so much to talk about, but maybe I want to start at the end and say, when people have finished reading this book, what would you like them to think, feel, and take away?
Well, you know, Peter, I've thought about that quite a lot. Apart from being a sort of cathartic experience for myself, I really would like the youth to take away something from this book. I think it does show that, you know, you can commit yourself to a cause and you can take it to the end, or as close to the end as you possibly can, given the constraints of age and so on, and that you can find fulfillment in really trying to forge a better society, wherever that may be. So I'm hoping that somehow it will, if they're reading still, of course, it will inspire the youth to follow their own passion.
Yours has been a remarkable life, and you know, in a few minutes we can't talk about everything, but there are key moments in everybody's life that perhaps change the course of one's history. And so one of them, I think, was 13 years old and you get on a bus, and that changed everything for you.
Absolutely. And I think, Peter, not that I wasn't conscious of the gross injustice of apartheid up to then, but the example that you cite is one where I did get on the bus, and the buses, of course, were segregated in those days. And an elderly woman got on with her parcels and had to go upstairs where black people had to sit in those days. And I was sitting at the front and I gave up my seat for her. And when I did so, the whole bus full of white people imploded with abuse. And I think that for me was, as my daughter called it, my aha moment. And I think I resolved right then and there that one could not keep quiet, that white people especially had to stand up and fight the injustice that was apartheid.
Take us through the journey of being an activist and a journalist, because, you know, a lot of people say journalists have got no business being activists. You must always be neutral, just report the stories. And yet you live in the middle of some really difficult periods of history. Take us through your journey and how you navigated these two hats.
Well, first off, just to say, Peter, you raise a very important point, and that is whether journalists can or should be activists. It also sort of brings up the issue of objectivity in journalism. And I'm one of those who say, you know, I went into journalism, I think, because I see journalists as kind of unelected public servants, if you like. And I think we do what we do because it is in the public service, and to represent especially those voices or those people who have no voice. So I've always been very ambivalent about the issue of journalistic objectivity. I mean, how can one really be objective about things like poverty, gender-based violence, corruption? You simply can't. I mean, your task is really to expose that kind of thing and what is happening and try and change things. It goes without saying, of course, that when you actually write your story, that you need to do so absolutely objectively and, you know, look at all sides of the story and so on. But the fact that you make the choice to write about those things, as we did, of course, in the early apartheid years, to expose the atrocities that were happening to Namibians, SWAPO supporting Namibians in particular, under the jackboot of apartheid. So one can't be objective about those things, and especially about when human rights are violated.
You had to be brave a lot of the time, and I wonder if you were conscious of it, that you were in fear sometimes, because you were in grave danger. You were detained, you were arrested, your offices were torched, bombed, and I believe a mercenary who killed SWAPO activist Anton Lubowski said that he was sent to kill you.
Yes, with hindsight, Peter, one looks at those things and thinks, gosh, how the heck did I make it through? But the fact was, at the time, I think I was so certain about what I was doing and so resolved to try and make a difference that I kind of brushed those things aside in the moment. And yes, there were times certainly that I felt quite a lot of fear. And especially, when I was in jail a number of months pregnant with my daughter, Liberty, and I would think, why am I doing this to myself and my family? But at the same time, I always resolved that one day I'd speak to the kids and say to them, look, if you could have had it otherwise, would you have had preferred a mother who did something else rather than put everybody's lives on the line? And when I did so, when they both were a little bit older, they both agreed that I'd done the right thing. So that gave me some kind of affirmation because, of course, for a woman in journalism, especially in those days, one was also, as they are today, plagued with guilt about commitment to a cause and at the same time having to try to do justice to a family, kids, and the things that go along with it. So they were tough times, but I think, as I say, it's also required of women journalists today. I think in those days, I described it the other day, we had a kind of concrete ceiling, which was very hard to break. But nowadays, I think that ceiling is now glass. And I think it's over to young women journalists really just to, unfortunately, sometimes put themselves on the line to expose injustice wherever that may be and crack that ceiling whenever they can.
And I suppose working for the Advertiser, the Windhoek Observer, and the challenges you faced with the Namibian, freedom of the press was always something that was close to your heart. And eventually, co-chairing and championing the Windhoek Declaration, this has become something that you're associated with, this fierce battle for press freedom. During apartheid and those times, I think it was an obvious one, but do you think now, years later, post-independent Namibia, that this was still another battle that still needed to be fought for?
Absolutely. Peter, as we made gains, back in the 80s, there were a lot of brave journalists, especially in the Southern African region, who were dubbed at the time the guerrilla typewriters. And they were journalists who set up independent papers in countries, because let's face it, at the time we tend to forget apartheid was such a monstrous presence in the Southern African region, but there were other undemocratic governments, one-party states further afield where press freedom was not something that was part of the program. So these journalists like myself, like Max de Prieur and Freya Weekblad, many others on the subcontinent, set up independent newspapers to really tackle the regimes that they were facing and to fight for press freedom and free speech and things like that. And I think as, of course, Namibia freed itself in 1990 and got independence finally with at the time, what was regarded as a very good constitution, which enshrined rights like press freedom and freedom of speech, I think we began to look further afield and say, look, maybe we're more free here now, but we really need to spread that message further afield. And so I think that UNESCO seminar in 1991, which gave rise to the Windhoek Declaration, was a very important moment for African journalists to raise their voices in unison virtually and say, we need to speak on behalf of the people, and we need to be free, and we need to be able to be independent, and we need to put propaganda and those sort of things aside. And so I think that was a very seminal moment for African journalists, and I was very proud to be part of that.
All right, perhaps to wrap up this conversation, Guy Berger said of you that a country can make its people, but also people can make the country. And he said that you were very much a part of making Namibia. And I just wonder, when you look back at all the what you've done, the work that you did, journalism, can it really change the world?
Oh, I do believe it can, Peter, especially good journalism. You know, I like to nowadays, when I talk about journalism, I refer to good journalism, because I think the line between media and journalism has become so blurred in this digital age that I think we need to go back to the good old days where journalists really had the trust of the population, were close to their people, close to their communities, reflecting their needs, their desires, and their aspirations. And yes, I mean, all these decades later, Namibia is perhaps not the success story that I certainly hoped it would be. But I think with enough brave voices out there for journalists to really bring truth to the people, give them the access to information they need to make those important daily choices in their lives and to be fully participatory citizens in their own democracy, yes, I think we can and we should make a difference. And even if at the end of the day we don't succeed entirely, we can never stop trying.
Well, Gwen Lister, thank you so much for trying so hard for so long and doing amazing work. Can't wait to get my hands on your book. Thank you so much indeed for sharing this time with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right, that's a veteran journalist, renowned journalist, Gwen Lister, sharing her thoughts about her book, Comrade Editor. All right. Okay, time now for us to go back into our news archives to take you back to the 12th of June 2005, and that's when Queen Modibe Modiba, known as the Rain Queen of South Africa's Balobedu people, died. The 27-year-old Queen died 2 years after she was crowned, and this is how the SABC covered the story.
The Balobedu people are in mourning following the death of 28-year-old Queen Modibe Modiba, the Rain Queen.
It might not rain for some time in this village of Balobedu. After days of speculation, it was confirmed today that Rain Queen Modibe Modiba has died.
She had some complications from Friday and she was rushed to Mediclinic in Pietersburg by Friday, and on Sunday she passed away.
The 28-year-old queen was inaugurated 2 years ago following the death of her grandmother, Queen Modibe Modiba. Late last year, Modibe's health started deteriorating. She was in and out of hospital, but her family refused to discuss her illness. Today, they still wouldn't confirm what caused her death. Modibe is survived by a brother and 2 children. Funeral arrangements are still being finalized. Dendanchi Dabo, SABC, Balobedu.
It's time now for us to take a look at those newspaper front pages once again, and to help us discuss this, we're joined once again by William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. William, thanks for joining us once again. City Press, I believe, has grabbed your attention. What's on the front page?
So for me, the big story is, of course, the political wranglings that are still going on and the conflicts within the ANC around the MK-MVA and its disbandment. But the story really for me from there is the piece by Modibe Mokoena talking about, you know, people are all getting excited and happy about the Ramaphosa's decision around energy, etc. And he says, you know, these are things that actually he spoke about in 2018. So, you know, it's not that he's moving slowly, it's that these things are happening. He's got a lovely line in there where he says, you know, since 2018 till now, we've had the grating sound of thumbs twiddling, which I think is about the best line of the day in any of the Sunday papers.
And there does seem to be, and this is what the paper is suggesting, that the president has is cementing his position within the ruling party. And some might say that that job is far harder than actually running the country.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's what I like about the contrast of those two pieces. So you've got that idea of, you know, his power within the ANC and the challenges against that, and you know, the political machinations that are going on there. And then you've got again that conflict of saying, well, you know, he's taken some seemingly decisive action this week, and then the counter to that. So it's like he's got power, but he hasn't. And you know, look, I think the one thing that any of us can generally agree on is that I'm very pleased that he's in that job and not me.
All right, which other paper got your attention?
So I think that the Sunday world, I think that the focus still on the digital vibes issue is really critical, not necessarily because of the scandal, but just because as we're going into the third wave, I think there were 9,000, just under 10,000 cases yesterday. This third wave, people are losing their lives in the context of our president. Also then, a really good thing, making the announcement about the TRIPS waiver, calling for vaccines to be made all over the world and cheaply and easily. So to be focusing on that is an important element, because it's dealing with a crisis within the most central department at the moment, the Department of Health. And again, I don't feel like we're getting any kind of clarity to just be told, well, we must wait for the SIU report, and and then to hear this story that actually it's because of the fact that they didn't want to act against some of the people in case it then reflected badly. That sounds like some kind of very odd political backtracking things that are going on there. So I think that because of the crisis around COVID at the moment and the pandemic, that story is even bigger and of greater critical importance, not just to the political issues around government and potential corruption, etc., but because of the pandemic.
I mean, the way this story started and it was unfolding, and then all of a sudden you hear this man very contrite, apologizing, taking responsibility, asking for special leave, and then 2 hours later the president says, yes, you can have your special leave. It's almost as if something happened at some point and then they just decided, look, you've got to go, sadly.
Yeah, there is something very odd going on there that, again, is kind of above our pay grade in terms of understanding and having access to those political levels, I guess, because it's clear that there are bigger political issues at play there. The unfortunate thing about this is that, Dr. Mkhize is actually a doctor. So his grasp of the issues of what's been going around with the pandemic, and there are a lot of legitimate critiques of the way that things have been handled, but there are also a lot of really incredibly positive moves about the way that he's been dealing with this. So for the president, it's a really, really difficult kind of decision, especially then given his power within the ruling party. What he doesn't want, I guess, is to be kicking him out, and then he goes into the welcome opening arms of the faction that goes against him. And I guess for him politically, that's his kind of big battle. And yet he also then has to deal with the issue of 150 million rand that seems to have disappeared into the ether, and the value that we've got for that as the public seems to be negligible.
And another paper, perhaps, that grabbed your attention?
So I think that the one you mentioned it at the start, is the one about the price of trains. That as a contract, I think, is still such a big issue, because of course our railways are in a incredibly partisan, disastrous state. It is an epic failure of looking after our public resources, and it's not just the size of the engine. It's about the entire way that our railway systems appear to be managed. They've been underutilized. We've seen all the stories about the stations being trashed and gutted for anything of any value, and it's going to take decades. We talk about what's happening with the SAA. Our railway system has been gutted, and we've allowed one of those precious resources to be gutted in that way. It really is a tragedy.
William, always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
Thank you.
All right, that's William Bird, Director at Media Monitoring Africa, taking us through the papers, which you can read for yourselves. That's how we come to the end of this week's edition of Media Monitor. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and we'll see you again at the same time next week. In the meantime, please take care of each other, be careful out there, make sure that you cover up. Good night. Goodbye. Did I say good night? Goodbye. Cheers.